The pin pulls free. 4 seconds. The soldier realizes his mistake too late. North Africa, 1942, and a small red sphere is about to change everything the British thought they knew about hand grenades. This is the story of the SRCM Modello 35, the Italian hand grenade that earned a reputation so deadly, so unforgiving, that Allied soldiers gave it a name that sent chills down their spines: the Red Devil. And what made this weapon different wasn't just its killing power, it was something far more sinister, something hidden in its design that made it as dangerous to the thrower as it was to the enemy. But before we understand why this grenade became one of the most feared weapons in the Mediterranean theater, we need to go back to where it all began, to understand the desperation that created it and the tactical nightmare that made it necessary. Because Italy entered World War II with a military that was woefully unprepared for modern warfare. Their equipment was outdated, their industrial capacity was limited, and their strategic position was precarious. Squeezed between the demands of their German allies and the realities of fighting across 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and the Balkans, Italian soldiers needed weapons that were cheap to produce, simple to use, and devastatingly effective. And the hand grenade, that ancient weapon of close-quarters combat, became a priority for Italian weapons designers who understood that in the brutal reality of trench warfare, urban combat, and mountain fighting, sometimes the most important weapon a soldier carries is the one he can throw. The development of the SRCM Modello 35 began in the mid-1930s, during a period when Italy was aggressively modernizing its military in preparation for Mussolini's imperial ambitions. Italian engineers studied grenade designs from the First World War, analyzing what worked and what failed in the trenches of the Western Front. They looked at the British Mills bomb, the German Stielhahn-Granate, the French F-1. Each design had strengths and weaknesses. Each represented different philosophical approaches to the same basic problem. How do you pack enough explosive power into something small enough to throw, stable enough to carry safely, and reliable enough to detonate when and where you want it to? The Italian answer was the SRCM Modello 35, and from the moment it entered production, it was clear this wasn't just another hand grenade. The designation SRCM stood for Società Romana Castelli Meccanici, the Roman company that manufactured it, while Modello 35 simply indicated its adoption year of 1935. But soldiers didn't call it by its official designation. They called it the Bomba a mano in Italian, or more ominously, the Red Devil in English. And that nickname wasn't given lightly, because this grenade had characteristics that made it uniquely dangerous, in ways that would only become clear when soldiers actually started using it in combat. The design was deceptively simple: a sphere, about the size of a tennis ball, painted in distinctive red or sometimes red-orange paint that made it instantly recognizable. The spherical shape wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional, based on the principle that a sphere fragments more evenly than other shapes, distributing its deadly payload in all directions with brutal efficiency. The body was constructed from segmented cast iron, scored on the inside with precise grooves that predetermined how the metal would shatter upon detonation, creating fragments of relatively uniform size and weight. This was sophisticated engineering disguised as simplicity, because controlling fragmentation patterns was one of the greatest challenges in grenade design. Too large and the fragments lose velocity quickly, becoming less lethal. Too small and they lack the mass to cause significant injury. The SRCM Modello 35 struck a balance, producing fragments that were heavy enough to penetrate flesh and light equipment, fast enough to maintain lethality out to about 10 meters, and numerous enough to saturate the kill zone with hundreds of pieces of supersonic metal. But the real secret of the Red Devil lay in what was inside that cast iron shell. And this is where Italian engineers made choices that would define the weapon's reputation for the entire war. The explosive filler was a mixture based on TNT, approximately 50 grams of it, packed tightly into the hollow core of the sphere. 50 grams might not sound like much. It's about the weight of a golf ball. But when properly detonated, it generates a blast wave powerful enough to rupture organs and fragment the iron casing into deadly shrapnel. The fuse mechanism was where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. Because the SRCM Modello 35 used what's called a time delay friction fuse. And understanding how this fuse worked is crucial to understanding why the Red Devil earned its fearsome reputation. The design was deceptively simple. A sphere, about the size of a tennis ball, painted in distinctive red or sometimes red-orange paint that made it instantly recognizable. The spherical shape wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional, based on the principle that a sphere fragments more evenly than other shapes, distributing its deadly payload in all directions with brutal efficiency. The body was constructed from segmented cast iron, scored on the inside with precise grooves that predetermined how the metal would shatter upon detonation, creating fragments of relatively uniform size and weight. This was sophisticated engineering disguised as simplicity, because controlling fragmentation patterns was one of the greatest challenges in grenade design. Too large and the fragments lose velocity quickly, becoming less lethal. Too small and they lack the mass to cause significant injury. The SRCM Modello 35 struck a balance, producing fragments that were heavy enough to penetrate flesh and light equipment, fast enough to maintain lethality out to about 10 meters, and numerous enough to saturate the kill zone with hundreds of pieces of supersonic metal. But the real secret of the Red Devil lay in what was inside that cast iron shell. And this is where Italian engineers made choices that would define the weapon's reputation for the entire war. The explosive filler was a mixture based on TNT, approximately 50 grams of it, packed tightly into the hollow core of the sphere. 50 grams might not sound like much, it's about the weight of a golf ball. But when properly detonated, it generates a blast wave powerful enough to rupture organs and fragment the iron casing into deadly shrapnel. The fuse mechanism was where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. Because the SRCM Modello 35 used what's called a time delay friction fuse. And understanding how this fuse worked is crucial to understanding why the Red Devil earned its fearsome reputation. At the top of the grenade, accessible through a protective cap, was a simple but effective firing mechanism consisting of a friction igniter, similar to a match head, attached to a length of delay cord that burned at a precise rate. The delay cord was the grenade's timer, impregnated with chemicals that ensured it burned consistently, regardless of weather conditions, humidity, or altitude. And here's where the design became both brilliant and brutally unforgiving. The delay time was fixed at 4 seconds from the moment the igniter was struck. There was no safety lever, no spoon that flew off when you released it, no secondary safety mechanism beyond the protective cap. You pulled the igniter cord, the friction igniter sparked, the delay fuse began burning, and in exactly 4 seconds, the grenade exploded. Period. There was no going back, no way to make it safe again, no option to reconsider your throw. Once that cord was pulled, you had 4 seconds to get rid of it or die trying. And this design philosophy represented a fundamental difference in how Italian engineers thought about hand grenades compared to their Allied counterparts. British and American grenades used spring-loaded striker mechanisms with safety levers. You could pull the pin, hold the grenade with the lever depressed, assess the situation, and, if necessary, replace the pin and make the weapon safe again. The SRCM Modello 35 offered no such luxury. It was a weapon that demanded commitment, that punished hesitation, and that killed without discrimination between friend and foe if the thrower made a mistake. But why would Italian engineers design a grenade with such an unforgiving characteristic? What possible advantage could there be in creating a weapon that was as dangerous to your own troops as it was to the enemy? The answer lies in the tactical doctrine of close-quarters combat and the specific challenges of the environments where Italian forces expected to fight. In mountain warfare, in urban environments, in defensive positions where the enemy might be just meters away, the ability to throw a grenade and have it detonate instantly upon landing or in mid-air was a significant tactical advantage. Allied grenades with their 5 to 7 second delays gave defenders time to react, to pick up the grenade and throw it back, or to take cover. The 4-second delay of the Red Devil was calculated to minimize that reaction time, especially considering that the average soldier takes about 1.5 seconds to recognize a threat, assess it, and begin reacting. By the time you saw a Red Devil land near you, calculated your options, and started to move, you had maybe 2 seconds left. And 2 seconds isn't enough time to pick up a grenade, aim, and throw it back to a safe distance. It's barely enough time to hit the ground and pray. This made the SRCM Modelo 35 exceptionally effective at denying cover and forcing enemies out of defensive positions. But it also made it exceptionally dangerous to use, because 4 seconds is not a lot of time. A trained soldier could throw a grenade about 30 to 40 meters under ideal conditions. But in combat, under stress, encumbered by equipment, possibly wounded or exhausted, throws were often much shorter. And here's the terrifying mathematics. If you throw the grenade and it travels for 2 seconds before landing, it explodes 2 seconds later. But if your throw is weak, if you slip, if your timing is off and the grenade only travels for 1 second, it explodes in 3 seconds, possibly while your squad mates are still advancing, possibly while you're still in the fragmentation radius. Italian soldiers were trained extensively on the proper technique for using the Red Devil. They practiced the throwing motion until it became instinctive. They learned to count in their heads. They understood the lethal radius and the danger zone. But training can only do so much because combat has a way of making even the most carefully practiced skills fall apart under pressure. And there are documented cases throughout the North African and Italian campaigns of Italian soldiers being killed or wounded by their own Red Devil grenades. Fratricide incidents where a moment of panic, a slippery grip, or simple bad luck turned the weapon against its user. Yet despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, the SRCM Modelo 35 was produced in massive quantities. Italian factories churned out hundreds of thousands of these red spheres throughout the late 1930s and into the war years. They were issued to frontline infantry units, to assault troops, to mountain divisions, and to garrison forces across the Italian Empire. And when Italian soldiers went to war in 1940, the Red Devil went with them, seeing action in Greece, in Albania, in Yugoslavia, in the western desert of North Africa, and eventually in the desperate defense of Italy itself. British and Commonwealth forces first encountered the Red Devil in North Africa during the opening campaigns of the Western Desert War, where Italian forces under Marshal Graziani were dug into a series of fortified positions along the Libyan coast. And those first encounters were educational in the most brutal sense of the word, because Allied soldiers quickly learned that Italian hand grenades behaved differently from what they were used to. A British soldier taking cover in a trench might see a small red sphere arc overhead, land nearby, and following his training for dealing with German stick grenades, he might have a few precious seconds to react. But with the Red Devil, those seconds didn't exist. By the time you saw it, by the time you recognized what it was already too late. The fragmentation pattern was vicious, the cast iron body shattering into hundreds of irregularly shaped fragments that ricocheted off trench walls and equipment, causing wounds that were difficult to treat in field hospitals. The spherical design meant there was no safe direction, no side of the grenade that produced fewer fragments. It killed in all directions with equal enthusiasm, and this made it particularly effective in the close quarters fighting that characterized much of the North African campaign, where battles often devolved into desperate struggles over individual trenches, strongpoints, and fortified positions. But the Red Devil's reputation really solidified during the Italian campaign of 1943 to 1945 after Allied forces invaded Sicily and began the long, bloody push up the Italian peninsula. The mountainous terrain of Italy was perfect for defensive warfare, and Italian forces, now fighting alongside German units and sometimes in opposition to them after the Italian armistice, used the Red Devil extensively in defensive operations, in mountain passes, in fortified villages, in the rubble of bombed-out cities. The grenade proved its worth time and again. Allied after-action reports from Italy frequently mention encounters with Italian grenades, describing them variously as highly effective, dangerous, and requiring immediate evasive action. And that last phrase tells you everything you need to know about how Allied soldiers viewed the Red Devil. It wasn't a weapon you could be casual about. It demanded respect and immediate response, because hesitation meant death. And if you're fascinated by hidden WW2 secrets and weapons that change the nature of close-quarters combat like this, make sure to like this video. Because what made the Red Devil truly notorious wasn't just its design or its tactical employment, it was the psychological impact it had on both the soldiers who used it and the soldiers who faced it. And that psychological dimension is something that often gets overlooked in technical discussions of weapons, but is absolutely crucial to understanding their real battlefield effectiveness. For Italian soldiers, carrying Red Devils meant living with a constant low-level anxiety. These weren't weapons you could casually clip to your belt and forget about. The friction igniter mechanism, while reliable, was also vulnerable to accidental activation if the protective cap came loose. There are accounts of soldiers being killed when grenades detonated spontaneously after the cap was damaged in combat, or when rough handling caused the igniter to activate. This meant that Italian troops treated their grenades with a mixture of respect and fear, checking them constantly, securing them carefully, and always being conscious of where they were and what condition they were in. It created a psychological burden that compounded the already immense stress of combat. For Allied soldiers facing the Red Devil, the psychological impact was different but equally significant. The short delay time meant that taking cover from an Italian grenade attack required split-second reactions and often meant simply hitting the ground and hoping the fragments passed overhead. There was no time for the careful assessment of danger that soldiers prefer, no opportunity to take methodical defensive action. It was pure instinctive survival. And that kind of high-stress, reaction-based combat takes a psychological toll that accumulates over time. Soldiers who had survived close calls with Red Devils became hyper-vigilant, sometimes reacting to any thrown object with panic, sometimes freezing when they should have moved. Combat fatigue and battle stress were significantly influenced by weapons like the Red Devil that allowed no margin for error and no second chances. But beyond the immediate combat effects, the Red Devil also played a role in the broader narrative of Italian military performance during World War II. And this is where the story gets complicated, because Italian forces have often been unfairly stereotyped in popular histories of the war, portrayed as incompetent or cowardly, unwilling to fight, or incapable of effective combat. The reality was far more nuanced. Italian soldiers were often led by poor commanders, equipped with inadequate weapons, and sent into battles that were strategically pointless or tactically impossible. But when properly led, adequately equipped, and fighting for objectives they understood and believed in, Italian troops could be formidable opponents. And the Red Devil grenade was one of the weapons that demonstrated this capability. It was effective because it was well designed for its intended purpose. It was feared because it worked exactly as designed. And it earned respect from Allied soldiers who faced it because they understood that the men throwing these grenades were skilled and dangerous adversaries. The technical specifications of the SRCM Modello 35 tell part of the story. Total weight approximately 500 grams, diameter approximately 60 millimeters, explosive content 50 grams of TNT-based composition, effective fragmentation radius 10 meters, danger zone extending to 25 meters or more depending on terrain and whether fragments ricocheted off hard surfaces, delay time 4 seconds from ignition. But these dry numbers don't capture the reality of what it meant to use this weapon or to face it in combat. They don't convey the weight of that red sphere in your hand, knowing that once you pull the igniter, there's no going back. They don't describe the sound it made, the distinctive crack of the explosion followed by the whine of fragments cutting through the air. They don't explain what it felt like to see one land near you and know you had perhaps 2 seconds to live unless you moved right now. And they certainly don't capture the specific ways in which the Red Devil was employed in the tactical situations where it proved most effective. Italian defensive doctrine in mountainous terrain relied heavily on grenades for obvious reasons. In steep terrain where movement is difficult and visibility is limited, the hand grenade becomes one of the most effective weapons available. A soldier positioned above attacking troops can simply roll grenades down the slope, letting gravity do much of the work. And the Red Devil's spherical shape made it ideal for this tactic. Unlike stick grenades that might tumble unpredictably, the sphere rolled true, bouncing and rolling down rocky slopes until it found a target or detonated in mid-roll, creating a burst of fragments that swept across the hillside. In urban combat, the Red Devil proved equally valuable. Clearing rooms in close-quarters fighting required weapons that could deliver devastating firepower into confined spaces while minimizing risk to the attacking force. The technique was simple but effective. Pull the igniter, count 1 second, throw through the door or window. The grenade would detonate almost immediately after entering the room, giving defenders no time to react or take effective cover. The blast wave in a confined space was intensified by the walls, and the fragments, with nowhere to disperse, ricocheted multiple times, essentially turning the room into a blender of supersonic metal. It was brutally effective and absolutely terrifying for anyone on the receiving end. But the Red Devil also saw use in more creative applications that soldiers developed through field-expedient tactics. Some units began using them as booby traps, removing the protective cap and rigging the igniter to a tripwire. When an enemy soldier triggered the wire, it pulled the igniter, starting the 4-second countdown. By the time the victim realized what had happened, it was usually too late to escape the blast radius. This was technically a violation of the designed use parameters, but in the desperate circumstances of defensive warfare, such improvisation was common. Other soldiers discovered that the Red Devil could be effective against light vehicles, particularly unarmored trucks and motorcycles. Thrown from ambush positions, a grenade landing in or near an open vehicle could kill or wound occupants and potentially damage the vehicle itself, making it a useful tool for partisan and irregular warfare operations. And this brings us to an important aspect of the Red Devil's history that's often overlooked: its use by partisan forces during the Italian Civil War that followed the Armistice of 1943. When Italy switched sides and German forces occupied much of the country, Italian resistance fighters found themselves in need of weapons, any weapons, to fight against both the Germans and the Italian Social Republic fascist forces. Captured Red Devil grenades became prized possessions among partisan bands. They were portable, didn't require specialized training to use, and were devastatingly effective in ambush situations. Partisan tactics often involved hit-and-run attacks on German convoys, sentries, and isolated positions, where the ability to strike quickly and escape before reinforcements arrived was crucial. The Red Devil was perfect for these operations. You could approach a target, throw the grenade, and be disappearing into the countryside while it was still in flight, knowing it would detonate seconds later. German forces in Italy quickly learned to fear the distinctive red sphere, just as Allied forces had, and countermeasures were developed. German soldiers were trained to recognize Italian grenades on sight and to take immediate evasive action. They learned to use terrain and cover effectively, to position themselves so that grenade attacks would be less effective, and to respond to grenade attacks with overwhelming firepower to suppress follow-up throws. But countermeasures could only do so much, because fundamentally, the hand grenade is a weapon that's very difficult to defend against, especially one with such a short delay. You can wear body armor, but it won't stop grenade fragments from hitting exposed areas. You can take cover, but the fragments ricochet and find ways around obstacles. You can maintain distance, but in urban or mountain terrain, distance is a luxury you often don't have. The Red Devil exploited these fundamental tactical realities, and that's why it remained effective throughout the war despite its dangers and limitations. And if you want to discover more untold WW2 stories and deadly hidden technologies like the Red Devil that changed the course of battles, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear next will blow your mind as we explore the manufacturing secrets and the engineering decisions that made this weapon possible. Italian industrial capacity during World War II was limited compared to the major powers. They couldn't produce weapons with the same precision and quality control as German factories or in the same quantities as American industry. So Italian weapons designers had to be clever. They had to create designs that were effective but also manufacturable with the tools and resources available. The SRCM Modello 35 represented this philosophy perfectly. The cast iron body could be produced in relatively crude foundries using simple molds. The segmentation grooves could be cast directly into the shell, rather than machined afterward, saving time and equipment. The friction igniter mechanism was mechanically simple, using proven technology that dated back to the 19th century. It didn't require sophisticated electronics or precision timing mechanisms, just a chemical compound that burned at a predictable rate. This simplicity had several advantages. It made the grenade cheap to produce, with estimated unit costs far below comparable Allied or German grenades. It made the grenade reliable, with fewer moving parts meaning fewer potential failure points. And it made the grenade easy to maintain and store. The sealed design protected the explosive filling from moisture and contamination. And the friction igniter was stable under a wide range of environmental conditions. But simplicity also imposed limitations. The fixed 4-second delay couldn't be adjusted for different tactical situations. The friction igniter, while reliable, was vulnerable to damage that could cause premature detonation. And the cast iron construction, while effective for fragmentation, made the grenade rather heavy for its size, affecting throwing distance. These trade-offs were conscious design decisions. Italian engineers understood the limitations of their design, but they judged that the advantages outweighed the disadvantages for the specific requirements of Italian military doctrine. And the production numbers support this judgment because, despite Italy's limited industrial capacity, they manufactured enough SRCM Modello 35 grenades to equip their entire military and still have substantial stockpiles remaining. Estimates vary, but it's believed that several million Red Devils were produced between 1935 and 1943, making it one of Italy's most successfully mass-produced weapons of the war. These grenades saw service in every theater where Italian forces fought, from the freezing mountains of the Albanian front to the scorching deserts of Libya, from the Balkans to East Africa, and eventually in the defense of Italy itself. And remarkably, some SRCM Modello 35 grenades continued to see service long after World War II ended. Various military forces and insurgent groups used captured stockpiles for decades. There are documented cases of Red Devil grenades being used in conflicts in the Middle East and Africa as late as the 1970s and 1980s, testament to both the weapon's durability and the fact that hand grenades, unlike many weapons, don't become obsolete quickly. A well-designed grenade from 1935 is still an effective weapon 40 or 50 years later because the fundamental physics of explosives and fragmentation don't change. This longevity means that the Red Devil's combat history extends far beyond World War II, though the details of its post-war use are often poorly documented and fragmentary. But let's return to the war years and examine specific battles where the Red Devil played a significant role, because understanding weapons in the abstract is one thing, but understanding how they were actually used in specific tactical situations is what really brings history to life. One of the most significant engagements was the Battle of Keren in Eritrea, East Africa, in early 1941, where Italian colonial forces made a determined stand against British and Commonwealth troops advancing from Sudan. The battle was fought in extremely difficult mountain terrain, with Italian forces holding fortified positions on steep ridges and peaks. British and Indian troops attacking uphill against prepared defenses suffered heavy casualties, and Italian grenades, particularly the Red Devil, played a crucial role in the defense. Italian soldiers positioned on the heights above attacking troops used grenades extensively, rolling them down slopes and dropping them from rock overhangs onto British positions below. The 4-second delay meant that grenades often detonated in mid-air or immediately upon landing, giving attackers no chance to seek cover or throw them back. Allied after-action reports from Keren specifically mentioned the effectiveness of Italian grenade attacks and the difficulty of advancing under such fire. Eventually, British forces prevailed through superior numbers, artillery support, and flanking maneuvers, but the battle demonstrated that well-positioned Italian troops with effective weapons like the Red Devil could inflict serious casualties even against a numerically and technologically superior force. Another significant example comes from the defense of Tobruk during the siege of 1941, where Italian forces fighting alongside German Afrika Korps units attempted to capture the strategic port from Australian defenders. The fighting around Tobruk often involved night raids, patrol actions, and close-quarters combat in the perimeter defenses. Both sides used grenades extensively, and captured Italian grenades became prized items among Australian troops who appreciated their effectiveness even while recognizing their dangers. There are accounts of Australian soldiers using captured Red Devils against Italian and German positions, having learned through hard experience how to handle them safely and employ them effectively. This kind of cross-contamination of weapons was common in the fluid warfare of North Africa, where supply lines were tenuous and soldiers often used whatever weapons they could capture or scavenge. But perhaps the most intensive use of the Red Devil came during the Italian campaign of 1943 to 1945, particularly in the grinding attritional battles around the Gustav Line and later the Gothic Line, where Allied forces fought their way north through Italy against determined German and Italian resistance. The mountainous terrain of the Italian peninsula was arguably the most difficult combat environment of the entire European theater. Narrow valleys, steep ridges, limited roads, and countless fortified positions made every mile of advance costly and slow. In this environment, the hand grenade regained the importance it had held in World War I trench warfare. Soldiers on both sides carried as many grenades as they could manage, knowing that in close quarters fighting, in mountains, villages, and fortified positions, grenades were often more useful than rifles. The Red Devil saw extensive use by Italian Social Republic forces fighting alongside the Germans and by Italian partisan forces fighting against them, and this created the strange situation where the same weapon was being used by both sides of the Italian Civil War, each knowing exactly what the other's grenades could do because they were identical weapons. This intimate knowledge made the combat even more vicious, because when you know exactly how deadly your enemy's weapons are, when you've used those same weapons yourself, there's no illusion about what happens if you make a mistake. The psychological warfare aspect of this cannot be overstated. The Red Devil became a symbol, a physical manifestation of the brutal close-quarters nature of the Italian campaign, and its presence shaped tactical decisions at every level, from squad actions to company operations. But what happened to the Red Devil after the war ended? What became of the millions of grenades that had been manufactured? And what lessons did military forces take away from the experience of this weapon? The immediate post-war period saw massive disposal operations as Allied forces collected and destroyed Axis weapon stockpiles throughout Europe. Millions of tons of ammunition, including countless hand grenades, were either destroyed in place or dumped into the sea. Many SRCM Modelo 35 grenades met this fate, blown up in controlled demolitions, or loaded onto ships and dumped in deep water. But substantial quantities survived, either retained by military forces for study and training, hidden by partisan groups and arms dealers, or simply overlooked in the chaos of post-war Europe. The Italian military, reconstituted after the war as part of NATO, initially continued to use some stockpiles of Red Devils while developing new grenade designs, but by the 1950s, most had been phased out in favor of more modern weapons that incorporated lessons learned from World War II. Those lessons were significant because the Red Devil, despite its effectiveness, represented an older philosophy of grenade design, one that emphasized simplicity and lethality over safety and flexibility. Post-war grenade development moved toward designs with longer delays, more sophisticated safety mechanisms, and better fragmentation control. The goal was to create weapons that were as safe as possible to handle while still being devastatingly effective against enemy forces. Modern grenades typically have delays of 5 to 7 seconds and multiple safety features, including pins, levers, and sometimes electronic fuses. They're designed so that a soldier can safely carry them, can pull the pin and hold the grenade safely for several seconds if necessary, and can even replace the pin if the tactical situation changes. These features make modern grenades far safer for the user while maintaining or exceeding the lethality of older designs like the Red Devil. But in making grenades safer, something was also lost. The Red Devil's 4-second delay, for all its dangers, did provide a tactical advantage in certain situations. It minimized the enemy's reaction time, it made throwing grenades back effectively impossible, and it forced attackers to commit fully to their throws without hesitation. Modern grenades, with their longer delays, can sometimes be thrown back by alert defenders, reducing their effectiveness in assault operations. This trade-off between safety and tactical effectiveness continues to be debated in military circles, with some special operations forces using grenades with shorter delays for specific applications where the tactical advantage outweighs the increased risk. In this sense, the legacy of the Red Devil continues to influence modern weapons design, even if the specific weapon itself is obsolete. Today, surviving examples of the SRCM Modello 35 are found primarily in museums and private collections. They're popular items among military memorabilia collectors, though acquiring them legally requires careful attention to explosive ordnance regulations in most countries. Even deactivated grenades, with the explosive filling removed and the fuse mechanism disabled, are restricted items in many jurisdictions. Live specimens occasionally turn up at construction sites, in farmers' fields, or in attics where they were stored and forgotten after the war. These discoveries are always treated as serious hazards by police and military bomb disposal teams, because even after 80 years, the explosive filling in a Red Devil can still be viable, and the fuse mechanism can still function. There have been several documented cases of World War II-era grenades, including Red Devils, detonating accidentally when disturbed during construction or agricultural work, causing injuries and sometimes deaths decades after the war ended. This long-term danger is a sobering reminder that the legacy of war extends far beyond the period of actual conflict. Unexploded ordnance from World War II continues to kill and injure people across Europe even today, and weapons like the Red Devil, small enough to be easily overlooked and numerous enough that countless thousands remain undiscovered, represent a persistent hazard that will likely remain for generations to come. But beyond the physical danger, the Red Devil also represents something important about the nature of warfare and weapons design. It reminds us that the most effective weapons are not always the most sophisticated or the most expensive. Sometimes, effectiveness comes from simplicity, from a clear understanding of tactical requirements, and from accepting trade-offs that prioritize battlefield performance over other considerations. The Red Devil was never going to win design awards for safety or elegance. It was a brutal weapon, designed for brutal purposes. But within its sphere of operation, in the close-quarters nightmare of mountain warfare and urban combat, it was remarkably effective. It killed efficiently, it was cheap to manufacture, it was reliable under harsh conditions, and it forced tactical adaptations from every force that encountered it. These are the characteristics of a successful weapon, regardless of how we might feel about its safety or its humanitarian implications. And this brings us back to the fundamental question that runs through the entire story of the Red Devil. What price are we willing to pay for military effectiveness? How much risk to our own troops is acceptable in pursuit of greater lethality against the enemy? These questions don't have easy answers. They vary depending on circumstances, on the stakes of the conflict, on the broader strategic situation. Italian engineers in the 1930s made their choice. They designed a grenade that was highly effective but also highly dangerous, that killed enemies efficiently but also killed its users through accidents and misjudgments. They accepted those trade-offs because they believed the tactical advantages outweighed the costs. Modern weapons designers make different choices, prioritizing safety more highly because they operate in different contexts, with different values and different constraints. But the fundamental tension remains, and weapons like the Red Devil help us understand that tension by showing us what happens when the balance shifts in a different direction. As we look back across the decades at this small red sphere that caused so much death and destruction, we see not just a weapon, but a window into the specific circumstances that created it. We see Italian soldiers struggling with inadequate equipment and poor strategic leadership, making do with what they had and sometimes fighting with remarkable skill and courage despite the odds. We see Allied soldiers learning hard lessons about their enemy's capabilities, discovering that the Italian military, despite its shortcomings, possessed weapons and tactics that were genuinely dangerous. We see engineers and designers working within severe constraints to create effective weapons using limited resources. And we see the brutal mathematics of close-quarters combat, where fractions of a second can mean the difference between life and death, and where weapons that might seem crude or dangerous in peacetime prove their worth in the crucible of actual battle. The Red Devil wasn't the most famous weapon of World War II. It didn't change the strategic balance or decide the outcome of major campaigns. But in its own way, in the specific tactical situations where it was employed, it was as important to the soldiers using it or facing it as any tank, aircraft, or artillery piece. It was the weapon you reached for when the enemy was close, when there was no time for careful aim, when you needed to clear a room or defend a position and you needed to do it right now. And in those moments, the Red Devil delivered, with 4 seconds of burning fuse and then a blast that ended arguments permanently. If you love discovering the deadly secrets and untold stories of WW2 weapons like the Italian Red Devil, make sure to subscribe to this channel, because we're continuously uncovering more hidden histories from the war, from secret weapons projects to battlefield innovations that changed the course of history. A new video revealing even more forgotten technologies is coming very soon, and you won't want to miss it. The SRCM Modello 35, the Red Devil, remains a fascinating study in weapons design philosophy, tactical effectiveness, and the brutal realities of close-quarters combat. A small red sphere that contained enough explosive power and engineering ingenuity to earn a fearsome reputation that lasted throughout the war and beyond. That's the story of Italy's forbidden grenade, a weapon that was as dangerous to use as it was deadly to face, and that changed how soldiers fought and died in the mountains and streets of World War II.